World War II. The Black Death. The Mongol Conquests. When we speak of death on a global scale, these are the names that usually haunt our history books. We measure tragedy by the millions, and we assume that the darkest days of humanity belong to the modern era, or perhaps the Middle Ages. But we are wrong. If I told you that the deadliest event in human history, relative to the global population at the time, happened not in Europe, not in the trenches of the Somme, but 1200 years ago, in a land of poetry, silk, and perfume, would you believe me? The year is 755 AD. The Tang Dynasty of China is the center of the civilized world. It is an empire so wealthy, so advanced, and so populous that it feels untouchable. Yet, in the span of just 8 years, 2/3 of its population would vanish from the census records. 36 million people. Gone. That was 1/6 of the entire world's population at the time. Imagine if today, 1 billion people simply ceased to exist in less than a decade. That is the scale of the An Lushan Rebellion. This is not just a story about a war. This is a story about the fragility of civilization. It is a story of how a golden age, built over centuries, was burned to the ground by the ego of one man, the paranoia of another, and the desperate hunger of millions. This is the apocalypse of the ancient world. To understand the sheer magnitude of this fall, we must first stand at the summit. In the mid-8th century, the capital city of Chang'an was the greatest city on earth. While London was a muddy village and Paris was a collection of wooden shacks, Chang'an was a metropolis of 1 million people. It was a grid of perfect order, filled with Persian merchants, Turkish mercenaries, Indian monks, and Japanese scholars. It was a city where wine flowed like water, where poets likely wrote verses that are still recited today, and where the Silk Road brought the treasures of the world to the feet of the emperor. Ruling over this paradise was Emperor Xianzong. In his youth, he was a visionary. He stabilized the borders, reformed the economy, and ushered in the peak of Tang culture. But time is a cruel thief. As the emperor grew old, he grew weary of governing. He found solace not in the throne room, but in the arms of the most beautiful woman in Chinese history, Yang Guifei. The romance between the emperor and Lady Yang is legendary, often romanticized in opera and literature. But history tells a darker truth. To please her, the emperor ignored the crumbling state of his empire. He promoted her family members to high positions they were not qualified for. The court became a snake pit of corruption, jealousy, and excess. And while the emperor drank wine in his garden, watching the peonies bloom, a wolf was waiting at the gate. His name was An Lushan. If you saw him, you wouldn't tremble. You might even laugh. An Lushan was not your typical villain. He was a man of mixed Sogdian and Turkish descent, and he was enormous, weighing over 300 pounds. He played the role of the clumsy, lovable barbarian to perfection. He would perform silly dances in the palace to make the emperor laugh. He allowed himself to be treated like a jester, even allowing the emperor's consort to adopt him as a son, despite him being older than she was. The court saw a fat, harmless buffoon. But behind the mask of the clown lay the mind of a predator. An Lushan was a military genius. While the court partied, he was gathering power on the northern frontier. He controlled 3 massive armies, filled with battle-hardened veterans who were loyal only to him, not to the distant emperor. He saw the rot at the center of the empire. He saw a military that had grown soft from decades of peace. And he knew that the time for dancing was over. On December 16, 755 AD, the drums of war shattered the silence. An Lushan mobilized 150,000 soldiers and began his march south. The Golden Age ended not with a whimper, but with a thunderclap. The collapse was terrifyingly fast. The imperial troops, ill-equipped and poorly led, melted away before the rebel war machine. Cities that had known peace for generations were overrun in days. The ground shook under the hooves of the rebel cavalry. But the pivotal moment, the day that sealed the fate of millions, took place at the Tong Pass. Tong Pass was the gateway to the capital. It was a natural fortress, a narrow choke point defended by high mountains and the Yellow River. As long as Tong Pass held, the capital was safe. The defense was led by General Geshuhan, a veteran commander who was loyal, sick, and tired. He had nearly 200,000 men. His strategy was simple and correct: wait. The rebels were far from home. They would run out of supplies. All the imperial army had to do was stay behind the walls. But in the capital, paranoia had poisoned the emperor's mind. The prime minister, fearing the general's influence, whispered lies into the emperor's ear. He claimed the general was lingering because he was planning to defect. He questioned his loyalty. He questioned his bravery. Blinded by fear and manipulated by eunuchs, Emperor Xianzong made the worst military decision in Chinese history. He sent a sword to General Geshuhan with a direct order: attack immediately, or be executed for treason. One can only imagine the scene on the ramparts of Tong Pass. The old general, reading the decree, looking out at the impregnable defensive position he was being forced to abandon. He wailed aloud, looking up to the heavens, knowing that he and his men were walking to their deaths. But he was a soldier of the Tang. He obeyed. On a blistering summer day, 180,000 imperial soldiers marched out of the safety of the pass and into the open valley. An Lushan's veterans were waiting. It was not a battle, it was a harvest. The rebels lured the imperial army into a trap and unleashed a storm of arrows and heavy cavalry. In less than 24 hours, the grand army of the Tang Dynasty was annihilated. The Yellow River turned red. The road to Chang'an was wide open. The emperor, the men who had ruled the world, fled the city in the middle of the night like a common thief, abandoning his people to the wolves. The rebels entered the glorious capital. They burned the libraries. They looted the palaces. The city of 1 million people became a slaughterhouse. But the horror was only beginning. The war dragged on for 8 agonizing years. And it is here, in the middle of the chaos, that we encounter the darkest chapter of the rebellion. The Siege of Suiyang. If Tong Pass was a tragedy of incompetence, Suiyang was a tragedy of desperation. The city of Suiyang was the shield of the south. Beyond it lay the fertile rice fields and the Grand Canal, the economic artery of the empire. If Suiyang fell, the Tang Dynasty would starve. Defending the city was General Zhang Sun. He had only 7,000 men. Besieging him were over 100,000 rebels. For 10 months, Zhang Sun held the line. He was a tactical genius. He used war drums to confuse the enemy at night. He fired straw dummies over the walls to trick the rebels into wasting their arrows, then collected the arrows to use against them. He fought with a ferocity that terrified the enemy. But bravery cannot fill a stomach. As the siege dragged on into the winter of 757, the food ran out. First, they ate the grain reserves. Then, they ate the horses. Then, they boiled the leather armor and the paper from books. Then, they caught rats and sparrows. And finally, there was nothing left. The city was silent. The soldiers were too weak to hold their spears. Outside the walls, the rebels feasted. Inside, the people were turning into skeletons. General Zhang Sun faced an impossible choice. Surrender, and let the rebels overrun the south, ending the empire and dooming millions more. Or hold the line at the cost of his humanity. Historical records recount a scene that is difficult to speak of. Zhang Sun brought his own beloved concubine out before his starving soldiers. He spoke to them, saying that he could not feed them, but he could not let them starve while the empire was at stake. He then killed her, and offered her to his troops. The taboo was broken. The city descended into a living hell. The soldiers began to feed on the civilians. First the old, then the women, then the children. It is estimated that 20 to 30,000 citizens of Suiyang were consumed by the defenders. They kept the fortress for weeks longer, buying precious time for the imperial armies to regroup in the south. When the city finally fell, only 400 people remained alive. General Zhang Sun was captured. The rebel leader, respecting his tenacity, offered him a chance to surrender. Zhang Sun, too weak to speak, simply pointed to his empty mouth. He had chewed out his own teeth in frustration during the battle. He was executed. Suiyang is a stain on history that will never wash away. Was Zhang Sun a monster? Or was he the ultimate patriot who sacrificed everything, his soul included, to save his nation? It is a question that has no easy answer. Karma, however, eventually came for the architects of this madness. An Lushan, the man who started it all, achieved his dream of becoming emperor, but he found no joy in it. His body began to rot while he was still alive. He went blind from diabetes and developed ulcers covering his skin. He became paranoid and violent, beating his own advisors. In the end, he was not killed by a great hero on the battlefield. He was stabbed to death in his own tent, in the dark, by his own son and a eunuch he trusted. The rebellion eventually tore itself apart. The Tang Dynasty, with the help of foreign mercenaries, retook the capital. But the victory was hollow. When the poet Du Fu returned to Chang'an, he walked through the streets that had once been paved with gold. Now, they were overgrown with weeds. Foxes and rabbits made their dens in the ruins of the palace. He wrote, "The state is shattered, but the mountains and rivers remain." The census told the final tally. Before the rebellion, the tax rolls recorded 53 million people. Afterwards, only 17 million remained. Even accounting for those who fled or were not counted, the loss of life was apocalyptic. The golden age was over. The confidence, the openness, and the grandeur of the Tang Dynasty were replaced by xenophobia, warlordism, and a slow, painful decline. The An Lushan Rebellion serves as a grim memento mori for all civilizations. We often think that our societies are too big to fail, too advanced to collapse, too wealthy to starve. The citizens of Chang'an thought the same. They danced, they drank, and they wrote poetry, believing their golden age would last forever. But history teaches us that chaos is always waiting at the gate. It takes centuries of blood and sweat to build a civilization, but it takes only one moment of madness, one failure of leadership, and one spark of rebellion to burn it all down to ash. As we look back at the ruins of the Tang, we are reminded that peace is not the default state of human existence. It is a fragile miracle that must be guarded with vigilance. Because when the music stops, and the dancing ends, the silence that follows can be deafening. 36 million ghosts are watching us from the pages of history, whispering a warning we would do well to hear: nothing lasts forever. What do you think about the moral dilemma of General Zhang Sun? Was the survival of the empire worth the cost of its humanity? It is a question that haunts me. If you want to explore more of the darkest, forgotten corners of history, the wars that shape the world in blood and shadow, make sure you are subscribed. We have many more stories to tell. Until next time.